Good evening from Rocky Mountain PBS. I'm Cynthia Hessin. This is Colorado State of Mind. On Wednesday this week, the state legislature wrapped up the 2013 session, having made some landmark decisions and changes to current state law. Democrats, who hold the majority in both houses, came out feeling they had addressed a major portion of their original agenda. Minority Republicans were less happy with the way the session played out. Tonight, we're glad to get the inside view of that session with some of the Colorado Statehouse reporters who we have had here before and who have been immersed in all of this since January. From the Denver Business Journal, Ed Sealover, and from Colorado Public Radio, Megan Verlee. Also joining us from the Grand Junction Sentinel, Charles Ashby, and Eli Stokols from Fox 31. Thanks to everyone for being here. It wasn't really clear a week ago whether the General Assembly would get everything together in time to adjourn this Wednesday. I know, were covering some long, intense debates into the night late last week. One of them was over marijuana, and of course that was occasioned by what the Colorado voters passed last fall, making recreational marijuana legal. So the debate, or the biggest debate, is it right to say, Megan, was about how much tax should be levied?
Well, that was certainly one of the issues that stayed in play almost all the way to the end. And what passed eventually is a cumulative 25% tax, 15% excise, 10% sales on recreational marijuana. Now, of course, the legislature can't pass a tax. What they passed is something that will now go to the ballot, and voters will have to vote for it in the fall. Where a lot of the debate came in was, what's the right rate to both pay for the industry and the extra money that the language of Amendment 64 said would go to school construction, versus how high is too high and the voters are going to reject it, and then we're left with no revenue to run the regulatory system. And that led to long hours of conversation.
That was one of the bigger side debates. There were a lot of side debates on the marijuana stuff, particularly on the tax thing. The concern is that the people who voted for it, the marijuana lobby, is not going to want to actually tax itself, despite their promise in Amendment 64 to have $40 million for school construction. So there were some last-minute efforts to change that and put the whole thing in abeyance if the voters don't approve a tax increase, and there's still a lot of concern over that. So we're still going to hear a lot of that over the next few months as this campaign goes forward.
Concerned about a black market, which is funny because up until this point, that's all there's been, a black market for marijuana, but they want the tax rates to be somewhere where people will actually buy this legally, I guess, and not feed that black market.
Right.
Isn't there also, or was there not also a proposal to say that if the tax increase didn't pass, then the whole notion of having recreational marijuana could be repealed? That would have been quite a trick, wouldn't it?
For 3 hours there was that proposal.
Right. And on the third to the last day, it takes 3 days for a bill to get through, so on the third to the last day, the beginning of the week on Monday, there was this bill that came out, a ballot question that came out that would have done just that. If the voters say no, then we suspend the provisions of this thing until the voters say yes. So basically is what it was. And they had 24 lawmakers on both sides of the aisle, more than enough to get the 2/3 you need to get it on the ballot in just the Senate. But they hadn't talked to the people in the House, and the guys in the House said, no, we're not going there. We are not going to go there with this.
Made everybody's heads explode, though, for those 3 hours, which was fitting for the kind of legislative session we had. I thought it was a fitting, explosion for the final week.
Right, exactly. And there were no goldfish to chew on or any other munchies at the time.
It was par for the course, another giant issue that blew up out of nowhere and ate up a good chunk of everybody's time well after the workday had ended. And then went nowhere.
Yeah. Well, and there were so many fights. I mean, the driving while stoned provision that they finally passed, that had to be introduced or slapped on a bit like 3 different times,
right,
until the final week of the session, right, where there was finally enough, I guess people being resigned to the fact that they're going to do this.
And that was another one of the side issues that had come up. That bill had gotten introduced earlier in the session, and it would have been the 6th time I think it got introduced in the last, or 5th time over the last 3 years. And it got out of the House overwhelmingly, got into the Senate, and even though it was a softer bill than last year, it was not a per se, which means that, if you're over this limit of 5 nanograms per milliliter, then you're automatically, impaired, all right? So it's a softer one. And that earned a lot of votes in the House, but it went to the same committee in the Senate that it did last year and didn't get the votes, even though the Senate president sent it there because he supports it and thought it would pass. So then when the marijuana bill finally came up toward the end of the session, they tacked that whole bill into the marijuana bill, weighing that down, and the Speaker came up and said, wait, we can't do that. So let's introduce another new bill, which was the same bill that happened before, went through the House again. Speaker, or the Senate President John Moore sent it to a different committee, and it got out of the Senate with an overwhelming majority. So
the people who didn't want to vote it out of committee, what was their theorizing? They just don't.
A lot of it still had to do with the medical marijuana folks. They were concerned that the science isn't there for 5 nanograms. Are you really impaired at 5 nanograms?
If you're a habitual user.
If you're a habitual user, and so that's why they went to the lesser standard. Now, if you get a DUI, DUID, or however you want to phrase it, you can go to court, and you can say, look, yeah, I was over 5, but I wasn't impaired. Let me smoke some right here and tell you, and you'll see I'm not impaired. I don't know how you prove it, but that's how you do it. But some of them still said they weren't ready to go that far.
How are they going to do that when they make a traffic stop? How will they be able to determine your level of impairment?
But that's the whole thing. I mean, this is sort of a microcosm for the entire how do we regulate legal marijuana thing, because no one knows. It's never been done before. There's not a lot of science on what constitutes being stoned, officially stoned. We've never done that before. It's just always been illegal. And so what you saw with the DUID fight in the end was a lot like what you saw just generally with the task force, and then the committee at the Capitol, and then finally debating these bills. A lot of uncertainty. We want to err on the side of public safety, but we also have to abide by what the voters asked us to do. And that was really difficult. I think that's why it lasted till the 120th day of the session.
So probably some adjustments ahead on all of that.
Lawmakers have already said they'll be working on this again next year.
Yeah, and they argue, too, that, how long since Prohibition was ended, and we're still tweaking alcohol laws, so it's a natural thing.
Ed, what about jobs? That was certainly a rallying cry as the session began. It was all over the place during the election season. Jobs. What did the Colorado legislature accomplish in that area?
Well, if you listen to business groups, not a lot. Now, to give the House Democrats credit, they put out a jobs package at the start of the session, and they got all of the bills in that package through. And that involves things like a $17.5 million grant program for advanced industries like bioscience and aerospace. It can help companies bring products to market that can't do it now. It involves some financial help for small business development centers and for what's called an economic gardening program to pick out companies that look like they're going to grow and get the government involved in helping them to grow. But most business groups were real wild about this. They supported these things, but there's not a lot of feeling there's a lot can be done from there. Probably the best jobs bill was when they came very late in the session and got very little notice, and it's simply an extension of an existing tax credit that's given to companies that create 20 or more jobs. It's lured almost 7,200 jobs to this state with this tax credit in the last three years. And so, I mean, that's what they did to push it forward. Now, I think a lot of the debate was actually about, are you doing things to hurt jobs this session? And that was a constant rallying cry of both business groups and of Republicans, especially when it came to 9 different bills that regulated the oil and gas industry more strictly. Now, in the end, 7 of them died. But the issue of jobs was taken into account, not just how do we create more, but what are you doing to hurt jobs as well?
Go ahead.
Well, I think you could make an argument, the Democrats could, that the best jobs bill they passed was the budget, because revenues have come back. And so what we have now in this budget is a lot of money for capital construction projects that were on hold for a long time. So I think Ed has covered these issues more than anybody, and he's right, but I think, and we barely covered the jobs stuff because there was always so much else going on. How do you cover a jobs bill when there's a debate about guns or civil unions or all these other sort of more sexy things? But in the end of the day, the improving revenues and declining employment, maybe they can almost get away with not making that a centerpiece, at least in terms of the message. The Republicans are going to try to make that the message and message off of a lack of focus on that. But at this point, I don't know how much voters are going to sit there and say, I mean, maybe in your part of the state.
It's all going to depend on where the economy goes from here. If the economy keeps getting better, it doesn't matter that they didn't do more bills in this area. If the economy gets worse, they'll be blamed for harming it by not focusing on jobs in the economy.
But it does seem the state economists said this when they were talking about the revenues. We have turned the corner. You know, the good things that are happening for the economy are now they've reached a critical mass, and they're sort of outweighing the bad things. And so I think there's some confidence there that it's going to keep going in that direction.
Well, let's talk about those controversial things like guns and civil unions. Those were the marquee items in the session, wouldn't you say?
I think they're the ones that will have the longest shadow into coming years. Certainly, guns are an election issue, and while the legislature will likely be much quieter in its work next session, the mailers that start going out for the 2014 election, those gun control bills run by the Democrats are going to be front and center in those materials.
And they're going to be very loud. The mailers are already out on some of those things. So
just ask Sherry Giroux.
Oh, yeah. I mean, just wait, because it is, I think as you were saying before we started, that it could be a referendum on whether or not the Democrats did the right thing in gun control or gun violence control, whatever it is.
Whether a lot of them are turned out of office.
Yeah, I really think that will be how next year's election is interpreted, as a referendum on these issues. And I think Republicans are hoping, they feel like they have an issue they can run on. Democrats know they're going to try to run on that. And they are ready, because they know they have to defend these seats, because essentially they're defending their action on these votes. And if they lose a majority in one of these chambers, it'll be viewed as gun control is still, in this day and age, political suicide, just like it was for Congress in 1994. And I think there's just going to be a ton of money coming in. You think Mayor Bloomberg finished spending money when these bills got passed? Think again, because these seats and the message that this sends nationally, Colorado did gun control. Did they win or did they lose the following term?
And right now, as we're going right now, there are four, I think.
But is it going to maintain that momentum clear?
Well, that's a good question. The Republicans will keep it in front of your face over the next 18 months.
And I'm willing to bet, and I don't know what form they'll take, but you'll see Republicans introducing bills about guns in 2014, whether it be a straight repeal of what happened this year or some new flavor, just so they can keep that issue front and center with voters.
And there will be lawsuits in the courts as well that are starting to gear up. I think one thing that is interesting is that I talked with a lot of lawmakers who said they really wanted to get back home during the session and start framing these issues. They wanted to be meeting with constituents. They wanted to be out there getting ahead of the negative light that was going to come in on their gun votes. But the session was so busy that they didn't have time for the town halls, they didn't have time for the constituent outreach that they really wanted to be doing after, especially the Democrats, after they took those gun votes.
That's interesting. It was a jam-packed session. They each have a limit on the number of bills they can introduce. So does this just mean everyone introduced bills?
It's the legislature. The rules don't apply.
I see. It's a guideline.
It wasn't the number of bills, it was the number of large bills. I talked with a representative on the closing day who said that 2 weeks ago he ran out of space in his filing cabinet to put bills in it because there were just so many 50 and 100-page bills and so many amendments and so many changes. It was the policy size more than even just the number of bills being introduced.
Right, we've had previous sessions where we've had a lot more bills, but they just weren't as meaty or as weighty as these were.
It was hard to make coverage decisions this session because when these gun debates were going on, the asset bill, in-state tuition for undocumented immigrants, that was passing out of the House, going to the governor's desk. That had never happened before. Historic moment. And the best thing that we could do, it was like, I hear people cheering in the other chamber for this bill. You couldn't get to all the things that were going on. I think asset and civil unions are historic things, and they'll be in the history books. They'll make a huge impact on people's lives. There was no drama around the process this year because we knew that Democrats had the votes to get both those things through. It was kind of like a victory lap when people would come and testify on those bills. But I'll tell you, I haven't seen anything like the bill signings on both those bills in a long time. Mm-hmm. And the kind of relief and joy and just, this is a long fight on both of these things that have now, these fights have ended. And, seeing kids who know they're going to go to college, seeing couples who now feel like they're equal in the eyes of the state, that was a pretty special and historic moment, two moments for the state.
The turnout for those were just amazing. I mean, usually in a bill signing ceremony, there's, maybe 20, maybe 100 people, if that much, and there were thousands at both of those. So.
Well, it presented an interesting contrast to the testimony on the gun bills, where you had people who felt equally personal and passionate about the legislation that was being debated and turned out in record numbers as well. And I mean, one thing you can't say about this session is that you can't say it was abstract. This was a session where issues that really mattered to individual people came up for debate, passed, and are out there
Will
as
have
law.
impact after July 1st.
That's kind of interesting, too. Last year, when they were ending the session, and it ended with the civil unions, the Republicans kept saying to the Democrats over and over again, hey, when you guys were in charge the last time in 2010, you could have done this. Why didn't you do that? This year, they remembered that. I've talked to a lot of Democrats who said, okay, we'll take you up on that. And not only will we do civil unions, we'll do death penalty, we'll do, asset, we'll do elections, we'll do all this stuff, and they did.
Typically, when a party is out of power and regains power, like the Democrats did in the House, you'll see a few more bills coming into play because they've stored up things they wouldn't run when they know they couldn't pass them. But the comments around the session this year were that, it didn't seem like the Democrats had been out of power for 2 years. It seemed like they'd stored up things for 20 years and decided to run all of them this year, and it really, that's what it came down to.
What were some of the examples of the things that pass on a purely partisan vote?
I think almost everything we've talked about.
Yeah, pretty much. One of the big ones was the renewable energy standard for REAs, for tri-state generation. We already have a 30% standard by 2020 for utilities like Xcel, that sort of thing. And so in 2008, I think it was, they imposed a 10% standard on the REAs. Then they wanted to up it to 25%, and they ended up doing 20%. And that became the war on rural Colorado.
Yes.
It's going to raise rates. It was almost funny because
there was an ad campaign about that.
One of my local lawmakers, for example, from Grand Junction, got up there and he said, "This is going to put people out of their houses. Businesses are going to close." And what's funny is because in Grand Junction, for example, the major REA gets its power from Xcel, so therefore not affected by this bill. The other REA in his district actually passed a resolution in support of raising the standard. So it's a little, it was more politics than it was policy.
And so how do Republicans feel at this point? What did they regard the session as? Just trying to keep too many things from happening?
Overreach. That's the word they used.
Mm-hmm.
I had one describe it as being like in the passenger compartment of a runaway train, just holding onto her desk the whole time as Democratic policy after Democratic policy rushed past her.
Yeah, the former Speaker, Frank McNulty, a Republican from last year, said to me that when you're Speaker, not that he's got his issues as far as how he ran the thing, but he said what you do when you're Speaker is you do the controversial stuff and then you kind of let things die down so people can like each other again. Then you start it again. But this year was like we went here and then we stayed here the entire time. And so
what's interesting though? I think if we step back and we look at this in sort of context of beyond just this year and this past election, maybe it is a runaway train that the Democrats are driving, but this train started a decade ago, and they have consolidated power so well. They've built an infrastructure in the state. All they do, the Democrats in the state, is win elections. And you know what else has happened in that time? The state has changed, and so Hispanic population growth has exploded. The Hispanics got a lot of things this session that are great for their community. If they supported Democrats before, they'll support them even more now that they are doing undocumented immigrants getting driver's license. They repealed a law from 7 years ago, a mandatory reporting law, got rid of that. And I think if you look at this in context, next election year will sort of tell us, are we the blue state that we appear to be at this point? Republicans are frustrated, but they're not driving the bus or driving the train anymore. And, we'll see, did Democrats go too far, or are they in line with where Colorado is now? And we'll start to get that information, I think, maybe next fall.
I agree, and I think what's been interesting is that Republicans seem to have no power to stop anything this year. The one person who actually stopped this from being more of a pile-on was Governor John Hickenlooper. I mean, every time you saw oil and gas regulatory measures die, the sponsors bitterly complained it's because the governor didn't want these. Or late in the session, the Democrats introduced a bill that really helped out grocery unions by allowing defensively locked out workers to get unemployment benefits. And it only stopped because the governor went to the sponsor in the Senate and said, I'm not going to sign this, so let's not bring this on. So the truth is, the Republicans' biggest ally this session was Governor John Hickenlooper.
For putting the brakes on some of the things the Republicans considered more radical.
Absolutely.
He did a great job because he's in terms of not winding up with a lot on his desk that he's going to have to veto. Mm-hmm. So they reworked a lot of legislation, or they killed off a lot of legislation like that. The death penalty repeal bill was a very noticeable one. There were other criminal justice bills that didn't get introduced from Democrats because they didn't want to look more soft on crime. But the oil and gas thing is really interesting. They were fighting really hard. The governor's office was to sign a bill on the end of this. On the last day of the session, Wednesday, they were trying to sign. They really wanted this bill to increase fines for spills to come to their desk because they needed one bill that they could say, "Hey, we signed this. We're not just hooking up the oil and gas industry with whatever they want,
right,
or blocking what they don't want."
Right, and when the bill died, then he came out with an executive order, basically not doing what the bill said, but to have the Oil and Gas Commission that oversees the industry to look into this and see if maybe they're not doing the fines they kind of do, or need to be doing. So he's trying to give himself a little cover, but
that's a little cosmetic, though. I mean, at the end of the day,
is, yeah.
he may have a problem. I mean, he's pretty deft when it comes to dealing with the second floor and putting out fires. But on this one issue, it was pretty one-sided, and people will say the Democrats got everything they want. Well, the governor did not give them much of what they wanted on oil and gas, and he may have a small but growing problem with his base, with those folks who are seeing the wells being fracked out their backyard window. With those folks, with the environmental groups. We'll see how big of an impact they have.
A lot of those bills never even came up. I mean, some of the stuff were killed before they even started, like the setback
tell us
rules.
what they would have done. I mean, especially like regarding fracking.
There was actually nothing that would have been done regarding fracking. And in fact, the Democrats made a point to say, people want a ban on fracking. We're not going to do that. We understand that would destroy the industry. But instead they brought bills that would have taken promotion of the oil and gas industry out of the mission of the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission, which oversees the industry and is responsible for making sure that spills don't turn into disasters. They ran a bill to increase groundwater testing in the Wattenberg area, which is the most oil-rich part of the state. They ran a bill to increase fees on drillers to have local governments be able to do more to make up for the local impacts that are caused by increased drilling. And in each case, it was actually a small cadre of Senate Democrats who are considered more moderate who joined with Republicans to put these bills down, saying, in large part, this is an industry that is providing our state's economy a boost right now. We're not going to go there. And that, I guarantee you, that will probably be the biggest issue of the 2014 session, because Democratic leaders are saying, we're coming back with this.
Well, the two that you didn't see that I think we heard talked about a lot, one would have changed setbacks for drilling rigs from houses, which would have been a direct challenge to what the COGCC had just done, and hence a direct challenge to the governor. And the other would be shifting the balance of power so local governments could have more control over drilling in their borders. Those bills never even hit paper because the governor was so proactive on them.
But the oil and gas industry and the governor, they won on these issues in the building, but outside the building, what you hear people say is that the environmental community won, because the message off these bills is that the governor is aligned with industry and they're opposed to tightening the restrictions. They're opposed to cracking down on this industry and putting, they're putting public health at risk. That's what you hear people saying. And so I think the industry is now saying, okay, we've locked down these votes, but we have to do a better job messaging about the benefits that this industry brings to the state.
Well, speaking of outside the building, okay, so we're talking about what Republicans or Democratic lawmakers thought. What constituency groups went away happy or unhappy? Business, were there any particular parts of business who wanted something they didn't get, or?
Oh, yeah. I mean, when we talk about kind of the smaller effect economic development bills that passed, business wanted something different. There were 4 different bills that were run to cut back on the business personal property tax, which is considered the most onerous tax that businesses in the state face. All of them died in their first committee, and business wanted to see something like that. I can't say that business will go away happy. I think what you're looking at is maybe gays and lesbians will go away happy from this session.
Marijuana lobby?
Yeah, I mean the
Latino
Hispanic
community?
Yes.
The Hispanics got a lot. Gays got the one thing that they've been pushing for. I think there are a lot of winners. I think labor did pretty well on some things. I mean, the state workers got their first pay raise in 5 years, which again goes back to the budget. So there are a lot of groups that are happy, but they're Democratic constituency groups.
There was a bill that passed regarding firefighting. Can you tell us more about that?
Well, it's around collective bargaining for firefighters, so it would make it easier for professional firefighters to form unions, essentially. And that was back and forth all session long. Especially the municipal league just hated it because it would take a lot of the power out of local voters and out of local communities to say whether or not their firefighters could organize. But it was a very, very important bill for labor, in part because it was a bit of a proxy looking at the climate for business and labor issues in the state. It's going to the governor's desk with some amendments. We asked him about it throughout the session, and he was quite negative until the last changes were made, and I think it may have gotten to the point where he can put a pen to paper and sign his name.
Just a few seconds that we have left here. It sounds like what you're saying is that when you all go back in January to start covering the next session, some of these same issues are still going to be important or on the table because they either weren't resolved or somebody wants to change them.
It's going to be on the political issues. Remember, next year is an election year, and so that's when, like Ed says, the gun stuff is going to come up just to keep that issue in front of them. The union stuff they're going to bring back to appease their people, maybe even some renewable energy stuff to appease the enviros. So it's always politics. I've said it before, never leaves the building.
But hopefully it will be a quieter session.
Typically, sessions in election years are quieter sessions because they want to pass bills about puppies and sunshine to show voters what they can do. But I don't think after this year they will have that luxury next year. And as strange as it sounds, after we've been drinking from a fire hose all session, there are still a lot of issues that they want to come back with. Things that weren't touched this year included workers' comp reform was supposed to come up, and again, the oil and gas issues. I think 2014 is going to be not as interesting, but not slow.
Last comment, Eli?
I think now, the focus is still on the governor. It's about what's he going to do with Nathan Dunlap's execution. I think there are so many political things that are out there as we look ahead towards 2014. The fact that the session ended, we're still going to have a lot to cover.
Mm-hmm. And that is Colorado State of Mind for this weekend. You may see this program again or any of our programs at video.rmpbs.org. Thank you now to Eli Stokols and Charles Ashby, and to Megan Verlee and Ed Sealover. We appreciate all the insight on the just ended legislative session. Next week on Colorado State of Mind, we will have a new investigative report from iNews at Rocky Mountain PBS about gun deaths around Colorado. Please join us for that, and thank you for tuning in this weekend. I'm Cynthia Hessin. Good night.
It's the worst issue for John Hickenlooper of all time because this is a guy who always wants to find a third way. He wants to listen to this side, that side, and then find a middle ground. And Nathan Dunlap lives or he dies.
Yeah, that's no middle ground.
And he is just, he has people on his closest advisor is completely anti-death penalty.
He's tweeting about it.